In the darkness of a November night in 2003, as tornado sirens wailed across rural Oklahoma and power lines snapped like brittle bones, an 8-year-old boy named Colton Pierce disappeared into a storm that would swallow not just homes and trees, but the truth itself. 2 women. 2 stories. 1 missing child. And to this day, nobody knows what really happened when the lights went out. If this case sends chills down your spine, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Cold Case Crime Lab. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive and might be the key to finally finding answers for families still waiting for the truth. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're someone who follows cold cases like this one, your like really does make a difference in keeping these investigations in the public eye. Now, let's walk through what happened to Colton Pierce, a case that has haunted investigators and true crime followers for over 2 decades. Colton Pierce turned 8 years old on September 12, 2003. He celebrated with a small birthday party in the cramped but tidy living room of the mobile home he shared with his father Grant Pierce on the eastern edge of a rural Oklahoma town where the last street light gave way to miles of open fields and the occasional cluster of trees marking old property lines. The town itself was small enough that everyone knew the names of their neighbors' dogs, and the nearest Walmart sat away on a 2-lane highway that cut through farmland and pasture in equal measure. Grant Pierce was 34 years old that autumn, a man whose hands bore the permanent calluses of construction work, and whose face had been weathered by years of outdoor labor under the relentless Oklahoma sun. He had raised Colton alone since the boy was 3, following a custody arrangement that had left his ex-wife in Colorado with visitation rights she rarely exercised. Grant worked as a roofer and general laborer for a small construction company based out of Tulsa, taking jobs wherever the contracts materialized, sometimes locally, sometimes across state lines. The work was inconsistent, seasonal, and physically demanding, but it paid enough to keep their small household running. And Grant approached it with the quiet determination of a man who understood that stability for people like him was something you built one paycheck at a time. Colton was a quiet child, the kind of boy who preferred building elaborate structures with his collection of mismatched Lego blocks to running around outside with other children. His teachers at the elementary school described him as attentive and well-behaved, though somewhat shy, the type of student who would rather help the teacher organize art supplies during recess than join the chaos of the playground. He had a particular fondness for animals, especially the neighbor's golden retriever that would sometimes wander over to their property, and Colton would sit for hours on the front steps of the mobile home, gently petting the dog and talking to it in the soft, serious tone children use when they believe animals understand every word. The mobile home where Colton and Grant lived sat on a rented lot at the end of a gravel road that turned to mud with every heavy rain. It was a single-wide trailer, white with green trim that had faded to a pale seafoam color over the years, and it rested on concrete blocks with a small wooden deck Grant had built himself attached to the front door. The interior was modest but clean. Grant was particular about keeping the place organized, a habit he developed during a brief stint in the military before Colton was born, and he'd taught his son to put away his toys and make his bed each morning before school. Their life together had a predictable rhythm. Grant would wake Colton at 6:30 each weekday morning, and they would eat breakfast together at the small kitchen table, usually cereal or toast with peanut butter, while a local radio station played country music from a paint-splattered radio that sat on top of the refrigerator. Grant would then drive Colton to school in his pickup truck, an older Ford with rust spots along the wheel wells and a cracked windshield that Grant kept meaning to replace but never quite got around to. After dropping Colton off, Grant would head to whatever job site he was working that week, and Colton would be picked up after school by one of the neighbors who had children in the same grade, a rotating arrangement that Grant had worked out with several families in exchange for occasional handyman work or help with yard projects. In the evenings, Grant would pick Colton up from whichever neighbor had him that day, and they would return to the mobile home where Grant would make dinner, simple meals like spaghetti or hamburgers or chicken with rice, and they would eat while watching television together. Colton would then do his homework at the kitchen table while Grant cleaned up the dishes, and by 8:30, Colton would be in bed, and Grant would sit on the front deck with a beer, looking out at the dark fields and the distant lights of neighboring homes, smoking the occasional cigarette and thinking about whatever it is that tired men think about when the day is done and they have a few quiet moments to themselves. It wasn't a life of luxury or excitement, but it was stable and loving, and Colton seemed content with the small world that he and his father had built together. Grant attended every parent-teacher conference, every school event that his work schedule allowed, and he made sure that Colton always had clean clothes, hot meals, and a safe place to sleep. For all of Grant's rough edges and the hardness that years of manual labor had etched into his features, those who knew him recognized that he was devoted to his son in the quiet, unsentimental way of men who show love through actions rather than words. But in early November of 2003, Grant's work situation changed in a way that would alter the trajectory of both their lives forever. His construction company had landed a significant contract to work on a commercial building project in Arkansas, about 3 hours away from their home in Oklahoma. The job was expected to last several weeks, possibly stretching into early December, and it required the crew to work long hours, often starting before dawn and finishing well after dark. The company was providing accommodations for the workers, a motel near the job site where the crew would stay during the week, returning home only on weekends. For Grant, this presented a dilemma. The job paid better than most of the local work he'd been doing, and he couldn't afford to turn it down, especially with winter approaching and the seasonal slowdown in construction work that came with colder weather. But it meant leaving Colton for days at a time, and at 8 years old, Colton was too young to stay alone or to manage the logistics of getting himself to and from school. Grant considered various options, reaching out to neighbors and family friends to see if anyone could take Colton for a few weeks, but most people already had full households or work schedules that made it impractical. Then Sherry offered to help. Sherry Caldwell was 31 years old, a woman with shoulder-length brown hair that she usually wore pulled back in a ponytail, and a thin frame that suggested she'd never quite regained the weight she'd lost during a difficult period several years earlier. She had been seeing Grant on and off for about 8 months, though their relationship was casual and undefined, the kind of arrangement between two adults who enjoyed each other's company but hadn't made any formal commitments or introduced serious future plans into their conversations. Sherry worked part-time as a cashier at a local grocery store, and she lived alone in a small rental house about 15 minutes from Grant and Colton's mobile home. She had no children of her own, though she'd been married briefly in her early 20s, a marriage that had ended badly and left her wary of serious relationships. But she liked Grant, appreciated his straightforward nature and the fact that he didn't play games or make promises he couldn't keep, and she'd spent enough time around Colton to develop a genuine fondness for the boy. When Grant mentioned his predicament about the Arkansas job, Sherry suggested that Colton could stay with her during the weeks Grant was away. She had a spare bedroom, she pointed out, and her work schedule was flexible enough that she could get him to and from school. Grant was hesitant at first, not because he didn't trust Sherry, but because he'd never left Colton in someone else's care for such an extended period. But the alternatives were limited, and Sherry seemed genuinely willing to help, so after discussing it with Colton and getting the boy's reluctant agreement, Grant accepted her offer. The arrangement began in early November. Grant would leave for Arkansas on Monday mornings and return late Friday nights or early Saturday mornings, and during the week, Colton would stay at Sherry's house, sleeping in the spare bedroom and following a routine that Sherry and Grant had carefully worked out. Sherry would make sure Colton got to school on time, that he did his homework, that he ate properly and went to bed at a reasonable hour. Grant called every evening from the motel in Arkansas, speaking to Colton and asking about his day, reminding him to behave and to help Sherry around the house. For the first 2 weeks, the arrangement seemed to work reasonably well. Colton was quiet and compliant, though Sherry noticed that he seemed more withdrawn than usual, spending long periods in the spare bedroom reading or playing with the few toys he'd brought from home. She tried to engage him in conversation during dinner, asking about school and his friends, but his responses were brief and polite, and she got the sense that he was simply tolerating the situation until his father returned. Still, there were no major problems, no complaints from the school, no concerning behavior that would have given anyone reason to worry. Then came the third week of November. Weather forecasters had been tracking a powerful storm system moving across the central United States, a complex of severe thunderstorms that had the potential to produce tornadoes, large hail, and damaging winds. By Thursday, November 13, the forecasts had become more urgent, with meteorologists warning that Friday night into early Saturday morning could see a significant tornado outbreak across Oklahoma and neighboring states. The Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, had issued a high-risk forecast for severe weather, a relatively rare designation that indicated the potential for widespread dangerous storms. Grant called Sherry on Thursday evening after hearing about the weather forecast. He was concerned about whether he should come home early, but the cruise supervisor was pushing everyone to work through Friday to meet a deadline, and Grant worried that leaving early might jeopardize his standing with the company. Sherry assured him that she would keep a close eye on the weather and that she would take Colton to a safe location if storms developed. They agreed that Grant would try to leave Arkansas as early as possible on Friday evening, though both understood that if the storms materialized as predicted, driving through them might be more dangerous than staying put. Friday, November 15, 2003, began with an oppressive humidity that seemed unusual for mid-November. The morning sky was overcast, and by afternoon, the clouds had taken on a greenish tint that longtime Oklahoma residents recognized as a sign of severe weather. Sherry picked Colton up from school at 3:15 that afternoon, as she had done every weekday for the past 3 weeks. The school had sent home a note with all students informing parents about the severe weather threat and advising them to have a plan in place for the evening. When they arrived back at Sherry's house, she turned on the television to a local news station that was providing continuous weather coverage. The meteorologists were tracking the storm system as it approached from the west, and the radar images showed a solid line of intense thunderstorms moving toward their area, with numerous tornado warnings already in effect for counties to their west and southwest. The first tornado of the outbreak had touched down around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and by early evening, multiple tornadoes were on the ground simultaneously across western and central Oklahoma. Sherry made dinner for herself and Colton, though neither of them ate much, the tension of the approaching storms affecting their appetites. The power flickered several times during the meal, and outside, the wind had begun to pick up, bending the trees in the yard and sending leaves and small debris skittering across the street. By 7 o'clock, the tornado warnings had reached their county, and the television meteorologists were urging everyone to take shelter immediately. What happened next is where the stories diverge, where the clean narrative of facts gives way to conflicting accounts that have never been reconciled. According to Sherry's statement to police, given several days after the events of that night, she became increasingly worried about staying in her rental house as the storm approached. The house was an older wood frame structure with no basement or interior room that would provide adequate protection from a tornado. She decided that she and Colton would be safer at the home of her friend, a woman named Patricia Morris who lived about 4 miles away and whose house had a basement. Sherry said she called Patricia around 7:15 to ask if they could come over, and Patricia agreed. Sherry then told Colton to get in her car, a 2-door sedan that she kept parked in the driveway. It was already raining heavily, with lightning flashing almost continuously and the wind strong enough that Sherry had to fight to keep her car door from being ripped out of her hands. She said they drove through the storm, following a route that took them along county roads that were already accumulating water from the heavy rainfall. According to Sherry's account, they arrived at Patricia Morris's house around 7:30 or 7:45. The exact time was difficult for her to pinpoint because the power had gone out across the area, and she wasn't wearing a watch. She said she pulled into Patricia's driveway, a gravel drive that led to a small brick house set back from the road. She told Colton to run to the front door while she parked the car, and she said she watched him get out of the passenger seat and run through the rain toward the house. But here's where everything falls apart. Sherry said that after parking her car, she ran to the house herself, but when she got inside, Colton wasn't there. Patricia was waiting in the living room, she said, and Sherry asked where Colton was, assuming he'd already gone down to the basement. But Patricia said she hadn't seen any boy. Sherry said she panicked, running back outside into the storm to look for Colton, calling his name, checking around the property. But visibility was almost zero in the heavy rain and darkness, and with the tornado sirens wailing and the storm intensifying, she said she couldn't find any trace of him. According to Sherry, she and Patricia spent the next hours searching the property and the surrounding area as much as the dangerous weather conditions allowed, but they found nothing. The tornado sirens continued to sound, and at one point, they had to take shelter in Patricia's basement as what sounded like a tornado passed nearby. When they emerged, trees were down across the neighborhood, power lines were on the ground, and the roads were blocked with debris. Sherry said she tried to call the police, but the phone lines were down, and her cell phone had no signal, a common problem in rural Oklahoma at that time, especially during severe weather that damaged cell towers. She said she didn't make it back to her own house until Saturday afternoon, more than 12 hours after Colton had supposedly vanished from Patricia's driveway. By then, the full extent of the tornado outbreak was becoming clear. Multiple tornadoes had touched down across Oklahoma and neighboring states, causing widespread destruction and killing more than a dozen people. Emergency services were overwhelmed, with roads blocked, communications disrupted, and rescue crews focused on searching collapsed buildings and damaged neighborhoods for survivors. But when investigators eventually interviewed Patricia Morris, her account contradicted Sherry's in fundamental ways. Patricia confirmed that Sherry had called her on Friday evening to ask about coming over because of the storm warnings. She said she'd agreed and had been expecting Sherry and Colton to arrive. But Patricia insisted that they never showed up. She said she waited for them, watching out the window despite the storm, but never saw Sherry's car pull into the driveway. She said she never saw Colton run toward her house, never saw Sherry arrive and come inside panicked about a missing boy. According to Patricia, she spent the evening and night in her basement as the storms raged overhead, emerging Saturday morning to find significant damage in her neighborhood but no sign that Sherry had ever been there. The gravel driveway showed no fresh tire tracks beyond her own vehicle, though admittedly the heavy rain could have washed away such evidence. Patricia said the first she heard about Colton being missing was when Sherry contacted her on Saturday, and Patricia was confused and upset by the story, insisting that Sherry and Colton had never arrived at her house. So we have two directly contradictory accounts from two women who both insisted they were telling the truth. Sherry maintained that she drove Colton to Patricia's house, watched him run to the front door, and then discovered he'd vanished. Patricia maintained that Sherry and Colton never arrived at all, that she waited for them but they never showed up. There was no physical evidence to support either version of events. The storm had destroyed or compromised potential evidence. Tire tracks were washed away. Footprints were obliterated. The power outages meant there were no surveillance cameras operating in the area. Cell phone records were inconclusive, showing only that Sherry had indeed called Patricia's number that evening, but unable to pinpoint anyone's location with precision. Grant Pierce returned to Oklahoma late Saturday morning, having left Arkansas as soon as the roads were passable. He'd been trying to reach Sherry by phone throughout the night with no success, and the radio reports of the tornado outbreak had filled him with dread. When he finally made contact with Sherry on Saturday, she told him that Colton was missing, and Grant's world collapsed. He immediately drove to Patricia Morris's house, then to Sherry's house, then back to his own mobile home, searching desperately for any sign of his son. By Saturday evening, with Colton still unaccounted for, Grant contacted the local police to file a missing person report. The officers who responded were already stretched thin from dealing with storm-related emergencies, but they took the report seriously and began an investigation. They interviewed both Sherry and Patricia extensively, documenting the contradictions in their stories. They searched Patricia's property and the surrounding area, but the tornado damage made this difficult, with debris scattered across fields and roadways, making it nearly impossible to determine what had been displaced by the storm and what might be evidence related to Colton's disappearance. The investigation expanded over the following days and weeks. Police brought in search and rescue teams with dogs to comb through the areas around both Sherry's house and Patricia's house. They searched along the route Sherry claimed to have driven that night, checking ditches and fields for any sign that the car might have gone off the road or that Colton might have wandered away from the vehicle. They interviewed neighbors, teachers, family friends, anyone who had recent contact with Colton or who might have seen something unusual on the night of November 15th. They looked into both Sherry's and Patricia's backgrounds, searching for any history that might suggest a motive for harm or deception. Sherry had no criminal record, no history of violence or mental illness. Her ex-husband, when tracked down and interviewed, described her as troubled and difficult during their marriage but not dangerous. Her co-workers and acquaintances described her as quiet and somewhat isolated but with no obvious red flags. Patricia Morris was similarly unremarkable in background, a divorced mother of 2 adult children who worked as a bookkeeper and had no criminal history or concerning behavior in her past. Grant Pierce was also investigated, as is standard procedure in cases involving missing children. Investigators looked into his background, his relationship with Colton's mother, his finances, his work history. They found nothing that suggested he had any involvement in his son's disappearance. Co-workers in Arkansas confirmed that Grant had been on the job site on Friday, November 15th, and hadn't left until Saturday morning. Phone records showed his repeated attempts to reach Sherry throughout Friday night. By all accounts, Grant was a devoted father whose life had been shattered by the loss of his son. The question of what happened to Colton Pierce remained stubbornly unanswered. If Sherry's account was true, then Colton had somehow vanished from Patricia's driveway in the middle of a severe storm, running from a car to a house and disappearing in that brief span. Had he been disoriented by the storm and run in the wrong direction? Had he been struck by flying debris? Had someone grabbed him in those chaotic moments? These scenarios seemed unlikely but not impossible, and the storm's destruction of potential evidence made them difficult to rule out definitively. If Patricia's account was true, then Sherry had never driven Colton to Patricia's house at all, and something had happened elsewhere, either at Sherry's house or somewhere along the way. But what? And why would Sherry create such an elaborate false story? Investigators pressed her repeatedly on this point, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception, but Sherry remained adamant in her version of events. She took a polygraph test, which came back inconclusive, the examiner noting that the trauma and stress she was experiencing made it difficult to interpret the results reliably. The media attention on the case was initially limited. The tornado outbreak had dominated local and regional news for days, with stories of destruction and death overshadowing nearly everything else. Colton's disappearance was mentioned in local papers and on regional television news, but it competed for attention with more dramatic storm-related stories. As weeks passed and the investigation failed to produce answers, coverage dwindled, and the case faded from public attention. Grant Pierce didn't give up. He printed flyers with Colton's photo and distributed them throughout Oklahoma and neighboring states. He contacted national missing children's organizations and managed to get Colton's case listed in several databases. He gave interviews to any media outlet that would listen, pleading for information and keeping his son's case alive in whatever way he could. But as months turned into years with no breaks in the case, even Grant's efforts became less frequent, worn down by grief and the frustrating lack of progress. Sherry Caldwell moved away from the area within a year of Colton's disappearance. She told people she couldn't handle the suspicion and the constant questions, that some people in the community blamed her for what happened and made her life intolerable. She relocated to another state, and attempts to contact her for follow-up interviews were unsuccessful. Patricia Morris continued to live in her house, steadfast in her insistence that she'd never seen Colton that night and that she'd told investigators everything she knew. The case grew cold, filed away in a police department that had limited resources and more pressing matters to attend to. Occasionally, when remains were discovered elsewhere in Oklahoma or neighboring states, there would be renewed hope or fear that they might belong to Colton, but DNA testing always ruled out a connection. The years passed, and Colton's 8th birthday photo, the one from September 2003, became frozen in time, the image of a quiet boy who would never grow older in anyone's memory. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story and who cares enough about Colton Pierce to demand answers even after all these years. Theories about what happened to Colton have circulated among true crime enthusiasts and cold case investigators for years. Some believe that Sherry's account is essentially true, that she did drive Colton to Patricia's house, but that something tragic happened in the confusion of the storm. Perhaps Colton became disoriented in the darkness and heavy rain and wandered away from the house, eventually succumbing to exposure or being caught in the tornado's path. Perhaps his body was carried away by the storm and deposited in a location where it was never found, lost among the widespread destruction that scattered debris across hundreds of square miles. This theory is supported by the documented severity of the tornado outbreak that night. Multiple tornadoes touched down in the region, some with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, capable of moving vehicles, destroying buildings, and carrying debris for miles. If Colton had been caught outside in such conditions, his body could theoretically have been transported a considerable distance and buried under rubble, mud, or water in a way that subsequent searches failed to locate it. The timing of his disappearance, coinciding with one of the most violent tornado outbreaks in Oklahoma history, makes this scenario plausible, if heartbreaking. Others suspect that Sherry's account is false and that something happened to Colton before they ever left Sherry's house, or that they never went to Patricia's house at all. This theory raises troubling questions about motive. What reason would Sherry have had to harm an 8-year-old boy who was temporarily in her care? Investigators found no evidence of abuse or mistreatment during the weeks Colton had been staying with her. Teachers and others who saw Colton during that time reported no signs of physical harm or emotional distress beyond the normal adjustment difficulties of a child staying away from his father. Some have speculated about an accident at Sherry's house that she tried to cover up, perhaps Colton falling or being injured in a way that Sherry panicked about, leading her to dispose of his body and create the story about driving to Patricia's house. But again, this raises the question of opportunity. The timing of the tornado outbreak was well documented and not something Sherry could have predicted or planned around. If she'd harmed Colton at her house, she would have had to dispose of his body in the midst of a severe weather emergency, with roads flooding, power lines down, and tornado warnings in effect. It's possible but seems logistically complicated and risky. A third theory suggests that Colton may have been abducted by someone else entirely, either during the claimed trip to Patricia's house or at some other point that neither Sherry nor Patricia is being truthful about. This theory imagines an opportunistic predator who took advantage of the chaos of the storm to grab a vulnerable child. The severe weather would have meant fewer people outside, less visibility, more opportunity for someone to act without being seen. But this theory requires a level of coincidence and timing that strains credibility, and there were no reports of suspicious vehicles or individuals in the area that night, though admittedly, with the weather conditions and the focus on storm survival, such a person might have gone unnoticed. Then there are darker theories that implicate Grant Pierce himself, suggesting that his absence in Arkansas was somehow staged or that he had returned to Oklahoma without anyone knowing and had some involvement in his son's disappearance. But these theories have never been supported by evidence. Grant's whereabouts were accounted for through his work records and the testimony of numerous co-workers. The motel records showed him checking in and out at times consistent with his stated timeline. Phone records supported his claim of being in Arkansas and trying desperately to reach Sherry throughout Friday night. While it's always important to scrutinize family members in missing person cases, the evidence supporting Grant's innocence seems solid. Some have also questioned whether Patricia Morris's denial might be a lie, whether Sherry and Colton did arrive at her house and something happened there that Patricia has covered up. But investigators could find no motive for Patricia to harm Colton or to lie about his presence. She had no prior relationship with the boy, no known conflicts with Sherry or Grant, and no apparent reason to involve herself in something so terrible. Her home was searched thoroughly, including the basement where she claimed to have sheltered during the storm, and no evidence of Colton's presence or of any violence was discovered. The frustrating reality is that the storm may have destroyed the very evidence that could have answered these questions. If there had been tire tracks in Patricia's driveway, the rain washed them away. If there had been footprints or other physical traces of Colton's presence, the flooding and debris eliminated them. If there had been surveillance cameras or witnesses who saw Sherry's car that night, the widespread power outages and the fact that most people were sheltering indoors made such evidence unavailable. The case has been reviewed periodically over the years by cold case investigators, but no new evidence has emerged. Advances in forensic technology haven't helped because there's no physical evidence to test. Attempts to re-interview Sherry have been unsuccessful, and she has declined to participate in any renewed investigation efforts. Patricia Morris has been re-interviewed multiple times and has never wavered from her original statement. Grant Pierce continued to search for answers until his death in 2015 from heart disease, a condition his friends and family attributed in part to the stress and grief of losing Colton and never knowing what happened to him. Today, Colton Pierce would be in his late 20s if he's alive, though most investigators believe that's unlikely given the circumstances of his disappearance and the passage of time without any credible sightings or evidence of his survival. His case remains officially open, and his information is still listed in national databases for missing children, though the realistic hope of resolution grows dimmer with each passing year. The tragedy of Colton's case is compounded by the questions that will likely never be answered. Did he die in the storm, a victim of natural disaster and terrible timing? Did something more sinister happen, a crime hidden by coincidence and catastrophe? The truth lies somewhere in the gaps between two contradictory stories, obscured by rain and wind and the passage of time. What makes Colton's case particularly haunting is how easily it could have been different. If Grant's construction job had been local, Colton would have been with his father that night. If the tornado outbreak had occurred a week earlier or later, the circumstances would have been entirely different. If Sherry had made different choices about where to seek shelter, or if her relationship with Grant had never developed to the point where she was caring for Colton, the boy might still be alive today. The case is a reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly circumstances can align in devastating ways, and how sometimes the truth can be buried as thoroughly as if the earth itself had swallowed it. For those who knew Colton, the lack of closure has been its own form of torture. Grant Pierce died without ever knowing what happened to his son, without being able to bury him or even confirm that he was gone. Teachers who remembered Colton as a quiet, gentle student have wondered for years whether they missed some sign or whether there was anything different they could have done. Neighbors who saw him regularly during his short life have kept his photo on their refrigerators or in their memories, hoping against hope that someday there might be an answer. The community where Colton lived was small enough that his disappearance left a mark that's still visible more than 20 years later. People still mention the case occasionally, still speculate about what really happened, still express frustration that no one was ever held accountable and no body was ever found. The tornado outbreak of November 2003 is remembered partly for the destruction it caused and partly as the night Colton Pierce vanished, the two tragedies forever linked in local memory. In the broader world of missing children's cases, Colton's disappearance represents a particularly difficult category, those cases where the circumstances are so chaotic and the evidence so compromised that solving them becomes nearly impossible. The storm provided both a potential explanation for his disappearance and a convenient cover for any number of alternative scenarios. It created reasonable doubt about every theory while proving none of them. It gave everyone involved a plausible reason for gaps in their memories and inconsistencies in their stories while also making it impossible to verify any of those stories with physical evidence. For investigators, cases like Colton's are among the most frustrating. There's enough information to develop theories but not enough to prove anything. There are suspects without solid motives and motives without clear suspects. There's a grieving father who deserves answers and a missing child who deserves justice, but the tools to provide either have been washed away by rain or scattered by wind or simply lost to time. The case also raises uncomfortable questions about the systems meant to protect children. Should Grant Pierce have left his son with a girlfriend he'd been seeing for less than a year? Should there have been better oversight or welfare checks on Colton during those weeks? These questions are easier to ask in hindsight than to answer fairly. Grant was a working single father trying to provide for his son in difficult economic circumstances. He made what seemed at the time to be a reasonable arrangement with someone he trusted. The schools and social services had no reason to intervene in a situation that, by all appearances, was adequately meeting the child's needs. But Colton's disappearance highlights vulnerabilities in informal childcare arrangements and the risks that can emerge when children are placed in situations outside the traditional systems of oversight. It's a reminder that tragedies can occur not just through obvious neglect or malice but through the accumulation of small decisions and unfortunate circumstances that individually seem harmless but collectively create danger. The psychological impact on those involved has been profound and lasting. Grant Pierce lived the last 12 years of his life in a state of unresolved grief, unable to move forward but unable to go back. Friends reported that he became increasingly isolated, that he struggled with depression and anger, that he never recovered from the loss of his son and the inability to understand what had happened. His death certificate listed heart disease as the cause of death, but those who knew him believed he died of a broken heart, worn down by years of questions without answers. Sherry Caldwell's life was also irrevocably changed, regardless of what truth lies behind her account of that night. If she's telling the truth, she lives with the trauma of having lost a child in her care and the added burden of being suspected and doubted by many. If she's lying, she lives with whatever guilt or psychological burden comes from knowing what really happened and maintaining a false story for over 2 decades. Either way, her decision to leave the area and avoid further discussion of the case suggests someone deeply affected by the events, though whether from trauma or guilt remains unclear. Patricia Morris has maintained a consistent position of simple denial, saying she told the truth from the beginning and has nothing more to add. But she too has been affected by the case, having her name forever associated with a child's disappearance and having to live with the suspicion that some people in the community have directed toward her over the years. She's given occasional interviews reiterating that she never saw Colton that night and expressing sympathy for Grant Pierce while maintaining that she can't provide information she doesn't have. The broader true crime community has periodically revisited Colton's case, with amateur investigators and podcasters analyzing the details and proposing theories. Some have traveled to Oklahoma to visit the locations involved, though both Sherry's former rental house and Patricia's home have changed hands multiple times since 2003, and the current residents have no connection to the case. The mobile home where Colton lived with Grant has been removed from the lot, and the property sits empty now, a patch of grass and weeds with concrete blocks marking where a home once stood. These pilgrimages and investigations have generated discussion but no breakthroughs. The physical locations hold no secrets that weren't discovered in the original investigation. The passage of time has only made evidence gathering more difficult, not less. Witnesses' memories have faded or become contaminated by years of discussion and media coverage. The storm damage that might have held clues has long since been cleaned up and repaired. Yet the interest in Colton's case persists because it represents an enduring mystery, a puzzle with pieces that don't quite fit no matter how they're arranged. Every theory has elements that make sense and elements that don't. Every suspect has plausibility and implausibility in equal measure. Every scenario requires accepting either a tragic coincidence or a calculated deception, and neither option feels entirely satisfying. The case also resonates because Colton himself is easy to empathize with, a quiet, ordinary child who did nothing to deserve whatever fate befell him. He wasn't involved in risky behavior or dangerous situations. He was simply a boy staying with his father's girlfriend while his father worked out of state, doing his homework and waiting for the weekend when his father would return. He was a child who liked dogs and Lego blocks, who was shy at school but well-behaved, who had a small birthday party in a mobile home and seemed content with his simple life. The randomness of his disappearance, the way it emerged from what should have been a routine week, makes it particularly disturbing. It suggests that safety and security are more fragile than we like to believe, that catastrophe can arrive on an ordinary Friday evening, disguised as a weather event or a simple decision about where to ride out a storm. It reminds us that children are vulnerable in ways we can't always protect against, no matter how careful or loving their parents might be. For Grant Pierce, the inability to protect his son became a defining failure, one he never forgave himself for despite the fact that he'd done nothing obviously wrong. He'd made a reasonable decision to accept work that would improve their financial situation, and he'd arranged childcare with someone he trusted. But the outcome was catastrophic, and Grant carried that burden until it killed him, unable to reconcile the small decisions that led to enormous loss. The question of whether Colton could still be alive is one that haunted Grant and continues to trouble those who remember the case. In theory, it's possible that he survived that night and was taken by someone, possibly living under a different identity somewhere. But the practical obstacles to such a scenario are substantial. An 8-year-old child taken from Oklahoma in 2003 would now be a man in his late 20s. If he'd been raised by whoever took him, he might not even know his true identity or that he's a missing person. But for this to be true, someone would have had to abduct him in the midst of a severe tornado outbreak, in a rural area with limited opportunities for such a crime, and then successfully hide him for over 2 decades without ever being caught or the child escaping or revealing the truth. Most investigators consider this possibility remote at best. The more likely scenarios all involve Colton dying on or shortly after November 15, 2003, either as a result of the storm, an accident, or foul play. The question isn't whether he's alive but where his remains might be and what circumstances led to his death. And these questions may never be answered, the truth buried literally or figuratively too deep to ever be recovered. The case file on Colton Pierce remains open in the records of the local police department, a collection of reports, photographs, and interview transcripts that document an investigation that went nowhere. Periodically, a new detective will review the file, hoping to see something previous investigators missed, but so far, these reviews have only confirmed what was already known, that there's not enough evidence to draw definitive conclusions or bring charges against anyone. DNA databases are checked periodically against unidentified remains found across the country, but so far, none have matched Colton's genetic profile, which was established from items in Grant Pierce's mobile home. Age progression photos have been created showing what Colton might look like now if he's alive, but these have generated no credible leads. The rewards that were once offered for information have expired, the money never claimed because no one came forward with anything useful. In the absence of answers, people have created their own narratives to make sense of Colton's disappearance. Some prefer to believe he died quickly in the storm, that he didn't suffer or feel fear, that nature claimed him in a moment of violence that was impersonal and swift. Others believe there's a darker story, one involving betrayal or harm by someone he should have been able to trust. Still others hold on to the unlikely hope that he's somewhere alive, that someday there might be a reunion or at least confirmation that he survived. The truth is probably simpler and sadder than any elaborate theory. A child was placed in a difficult situation, a catastrophic storm created chaos and danger, and in the midst of that chaos, something went wrong. Whether it was the storm itself, a human error, or a deliberate act, the result was the same. Colton Pierce vanished, and the circumstances conspired to ensure that no one would ever be able to prove exactly what happened. For those who work on cold cases, Colton's disappearance is a reminder of the limitations of investigation. Not every case can be solved. Not every question can be answered. Sometimes the evidence simply doesn't exist, or it existed once but was destroyed by time or weather or happenstance. Sometimes people take their secrets to the grave. Sometimes the truth is known only to 1 or 2 people who will never speak, and the rest of us are left to wonder. The tornado outbreak of November 15, 2003, killed 17 people across Oklahoma and neighboring states. Hundreds were injured, thousands of homes were damaged or destroyed, and the economic impact ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. Among all that destruction and tragedy, one missing 8-year-old boy could have easily been overlooked, just another casualty of a terrible night. But Grant Pierce made sure his son wasn't forgotten, and the community that knew Colton has kept his memory alive, even as the years have passed without resolution. Today, when severe weather threatens Oklahoma, some people still think about Colton Pierce and wonder what might have been different if the storms had arrived on a different night or if Grant had made different choices about work and childcare. They wonder whether advances in technology might someday provide answers, whether some piece of evidence might surface that was overlooked in the initial investigation. But mostly they just remember a quiet boy who liked dogs and Lego blocks, who should have grown up to be a man but instead became a mystery that has outlasted everyone who truly knew him. The case serves as a stark reminder that not all mysteries have solutions, not all questions have answers, and not all families get closure. It's a reminder that sometimes despite our best efforts to investigate and understand, the truth remains elusive, hidden behind contradictory stories and destroyed by forces beyond our control. And it's a reminder that every missing person represents not just a statistic or a cold case file but a real child who was loved, who mattered, who deserved better than to simply vanish into a storm and never be seen again. Colton Pierce's disappearance remains one of Oklahoma's most perplexing missing person cases, a story with no ending, a puzzle with missing pieces that will probably never be found. His case continues to haunt those who knew him, trouble those who investigate it, and fascinate those who study unsolved mysteries. And somewhere, whether in an unmarked grave, scattered across the Oklahoma landscape by tornado winds, or hidden in a truth that someone has kept secret for over 20 years, the answer to what really happened waits, as it has waited for more than 2 decades, silent and unreachable. If this case has stayed with you, if you believe Colton Pierce deserves justice and answers, then please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Cold Case Crime Lab. Share this video, spread Colton's story, and keep his case alive. Someone out there knows something. Someone might recognize a detail they've forgotten. Your engagement could be the catalyst that finally brings the truth to light. Comment below with your theories, what you think happened that night, and let's keep the conversation going. For Colton. For Grant. For every family still searching for answers. Subscribe to Cold Case Crime Lab, because some cases should never go cold.